Hello friends, thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to like and subscribe as it greatly helps out the channel and I'd really appreciate it. Enjoy! Welcome to the first ever official social inquiry with yours truly, Dr. Duality. And I'm extremely excited to introduce my first ever guest, a good friend of mine, Dr. Terrence Hill. So today we're going to be talking a lot about COVID, health behaviors, and what can affect that. And so, as we get started, I'm going to let Dr. Hill kind of introduce himself. He's got some wonderful programs. They're actually close by, close to home at the University of Texas at San Antonio. So it's all you.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on and talk about my research. Before I get started, I just wanted to make clear that anything I might say reflects my own personal beliefs and research, and they don't reflect, of my employer or colleagues. I'm alone on an island today, Dr. Duality. So yeah, so I am a professor of sociology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I came here to be a part of a great sociology program here, and to help build a health program, be a part of a new health college. And part of that was, developing a new undergraduate program, health, aging, and society. That's really what brings me here. And and really leads me into this interest that I have, health lifestyles generally.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are interested in why people do individual health behaviors, like why do some people smoke and others don't, or why do some people drink too much, some people use illicit substances. But health lifestyle perspective is more of a sociological concept. It talks about how certain health related behaviors cluster within individuals, right? And there's this idea that people actually tend to be more or less healthy in terms of their health related behaviors, as opposed to uh, focusing on any particular individual health behavior, right? So if you smoke, you will also tend to maybe so forth, annual checkups and things like that. But people on the other end, more risk averse people will, maybe will be moderate drinkers. They won't smoke. They'll see the doctor regularly. They'll exercise, things like that. And so one of the sociological questions is, why is that? Why do we see this clustering of unhealthy or healthier behaviors in individuals? One of the reasons is to trace all those behaviors, social structural location, our institutional affiliations, our cultural beliefs, and so forth. That's really what is the glue, the social glue that kind of ties all these together. With
I really think that's so cool, right? It's and it's one of those, people have always asked me, it's like, well, so why do I do this? I'm like, there are numerous reasons, right? That's what to me has always made sociology so fascinating, right? Like you're saying, and what we're going to be discussing, these health behaviors and how they can be impacted, influenced by factors that, in a sense, at least in the material sense, you never see, you never like, if it's someone you never meet them. And it really is also shining a light on how does social media, right? You still have old school media, but I think social media really is, you scroll through Facebook or anything, all the different stories, all very, all this fascinating, all this kind of just information dump. And as I think, y'all kind of discussed in the research that we're going to be getting into here shortly, not all of it's good information. But it's like, hey, I'm like, well, it's I always look at it as, well, what are you conditioned to start accepting whilst also rejecting? So cool. So I think you hit it on the head. I think it's real clear why you love this research. I loved it. I really enjoyed the articles, so thank you for sending, and I will be linking those at the end of the video chat. So this first article, political ideology and pandemic lifestyles, y'all talked, and you're kind of beginning to discuss, the health lifestyle theory. And I really liked how y'all kind of expanded upon that. So really, y'all looked at empathy, authoritarian beliefs, and of course, the pandemic threat. So, can you kind of elaborate for us, why those three facets were chosen to
Mm-hmm.
supplement the health lifestyle theory?
Yeah. So, one of the kind of gaps in the health literature is kind of a lack of attention to political variables.
Okay.
And so most of the studies kind of focus on structural variables, like age, socioeconomic status. So we'll have, lots of studies showing like older adults having healthier lifestyles, women having healthier lifestyles,
Mhm.
and having riskier lifestyles, people with higher levels of education having healthier lifestyles. That's like the literature is kind of centered around sociological literature, kind of centered around those structural variables. But we haven't really been thinking a lot about political processes,
Mhm.
and this makes sense if you think about we were in this before the pandemic, before the infectious disease pandemic, we were really in this world of the causes of death were chronic disease, and so they were kind of structural and behavioral predictors kind of were important there. But in the world of the infectious disease, uh, start seeing political variables matter, right? Now if you think about this, like whether or not you're a Republican or Democrat maybe didn't necessarily matter for your body mass or your exercise level, something like that.
Right.
But because the pandemic was politicized, it introduced social distribution, a whole new social patterning of of behaviors and health outcomes um, that before the pandemic we didn't really have, and so it opened up this whole new world, and that's really drew, was I was in the middle of a pandemic, and I was trying to find something to occupy my time. The normal person will find a new podcast like this, or they will find a new TV show or a book. I found kind of a new world to explore in terms of health behaviors and health life.
And on that, right, it's one, living through a pandemic, which the last big one we saw was, right, the Spanish
Yeah,
flu, with
yeah,
a lot of fun history why it's even called that.
yeah.
Um, it, it's true, right? So almost 100 years or right at it, something close there. And, you talked about diving deep into sociology and like this is a whole new frontier. Like no one's ever thought about really studying pandemic health and behaviors the way that we have since it's come out. And I think it'd be a great opportunity. You, right, more or less kind of spearheaded the development of a brand new study, the CHAPS.
Mhm.
Would you like to let us all know what that is?
Yeah, so when I came to UTSA, UTSA provided a generous research support package, and I got together with colleagues in different units: sociology, social work, public health, um, uh, uh, criminology, other units. The college was also very of forming this interdisciplinary, interprofessional health survey that that would allow us to examine COVID related health issues in a general population. Just to be clear, this was funded by the pooling of individual research accounts. This was not funded by any particular grant. This is
Mhm.
not funded by any particular interests other than scientific interests. We had a
Right.
lot of people come together who had different interests. The criminologists had some crime variables. Social workers had some interested in neighborhood variables. Public health people had interested in diabetes, for example. I had interest in the styles, and that's this CHAP survey, crime, health, and politics surveys, really this kind of a reflection of this interdisciplinary collaboration, pooling of resources, and
And that's and
yeah,
I've
yeah,
been, you've
yeah,
been so gracious
yeah,
to let me
yeah,
go through it, and
yeah,
it is a
yeah,
awesome
yeah,
survey.
yeah,
And anyone in
yeah,
chat, if you've seen any of my other previous
yeah,
streams, when I talked to you about making surveys, kind of laid it out how it's not as easy as getting a piece of paper with questions on. It's extremely expensive, and yeah, it takes a lot of time. So
mm,
this to be individually funded and not go through a grant, which is the typical
mm,
go-to method, is just awesome. And
mm, mm,
it's congratulations on the success with that. Y'all published, right? Some of
yeah,
these are coming from
yeah,
the chaps
yes,
articles we're talking about. So
yes, yeah. The first one we want to talk about, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
I love
yeah,
it.
yeah,
So getting to this, kind of coming back to this article, right,
mhm,
on political ideology and the pandemic lifestyle. Really, y'all kind of highlighted you. at least it seems that there are these two, pillars of authority in the
Hmm.
U.S. society, right?
Hmm.
You have political and the science associated with the political authority,
Hmm.
and then you also have science from, like public health. So, this is kind of created. Frankly, it seems a very contentious
Hmm.
relationship between many of people and just the U.S. as a whole. I guess we just really do love to dichotomize anything. So, why do you think that the science propagated during the Trump administration deviated from the public health science?
Well, I think this all starts with general institutional that
Hmm.
pretty much all of our major social institutions have it's managed have kind of failed. That's created a lot of mistrust in a lack of confidence in our institutions, and I think that kind of opens the door for like competing authorities,
Hmm.
and people start looking for saviors and strong leaders and charismatic leaders and so forth. Enter Trump, enter Trump, and you start seeing this power struggle. You have this authoritarian type, who wants to be the voice in this country. And he also has this style of wanting to own the media cycle. And a big, easy way to do that is to constantly be conflicting with other institutions. And so we definitely saw this from the very beginning, a questioning of the pandemic. Because I think there was this paranoia that the pandemic initially was being exaggerated to undermine his chances in the next election, and that's why he was called impeachment hoax, or it was a way to try to impeach him or something like that. He was really personalizing the pandemic, making it part of his political. And I think, but he was very complex. I want to say this: he was very complex in the sense that he downplayed the coronavirus in public, talking to authors off the record. He would say like this is more serious, So it did seem like he actually really believed it was serious, even though he was telling the truth to the public. And like in that Bob Woodward that came out, everybody was like really upset that came out much later, that how Trump really the concern that he had. But this is a thing that I think is really interesting. He did question masks, you know, he was one of the few politicians that was consistently on board with vaccines. I don't know if you
Yeah,
remember this during the Democratic primaries. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden said that they would not be taking his vaccine because they trust it.
I
That
do not remember that.
that happened. That happened in national televised primary debates. They were asked if they would take Trump's vaccine because Trump wanted to identify the vaccine as like a
Hmm.
win for him. He
Right.
created this vaccine warp speed, and so we're going to be be kind of critical, seemingly critical of Republicans and conservatism, discussion. But I want to make this
Mhm.
really clear that the misinformation and skepticism about vaccines and so forth were not just coming from Republican. But back to your question, I want to say that there is a consistent theme about institutional failure and about a power struggle
Mhm.
that Trump kind of engaged in, and any kind of Republican or conservative or libertarian that is kind of anti-government or wants smaller government, is concerned about big government, that type of thing, questions the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. I think that really was like a social tension. It quickly entered kind of a cultural war, and that was just all part of the politicization of the pandemic and certain pandemic behaviors.
And that's
Yeah, yeah.
it. Wow. But and speaking of Trump, right, as Dr. Hill kind of mentioned, a lot of the studies or do focus on conservative ideology. And you said something that struck out to me. That Trump being charismatic, which he is very charismatic, and he did have a strong not only sense of authority, but gave him such huge authority. Um, so, what then could undermine a charismatic leader's sway in health practices? When they have such a strong base behind them that really rely or believe in this authoritarian style.
Well, I mean, this is the fundamental project. I think is restoring confidence in our institution,
Hmm.
restoring the functioning of our institutions. Because if we generally had faith that public health had our interests in mind, or if government had our interests in mind, the people's interests, as opposed to special interests in
Right.
mind, I think we would have laughed at him,
Mhm.
and he may have never been even elected. He ran on um, this adversarial relationship with with the deep state and big government and his own way of negative change, right?
Right.
And it's not a coincidence that we're electing these change candidates, because people are dissatisfied, distrusting, lack confidence in our social institutions. To me, that's where it all starts in terms of. Um, I don't know how you win the culture war
Yeah.
against Trump, or against like, or if it's even possible to win a culture war. Is it
Yeah.
possible? I'm not sure. I'm not like a cultural sociologist, but I don't know if it's possible to even to win a culture war. I would focus on you know uh, you know reviving our institutions,
Hmm.
making our institutions serve the interests of the people, increase confidence in our institutions, and then we start thinking about important issues in our society. Maybe we'll lean towards the authority we have confidence in, as opposed to the new charismatic leader.
Right. I no,
Mhm.
I agree. I mean, it makes sense, and it's especially like you said, if you don't have that confidence, it opens the way for someone to come in riding in as the whole savior, and it is interesting because you're right. One being opposed, Trump being very opposed to masks, or at least downplaying them, but very pro vaccine.
Mhm.
I do remember like some people were kind of like, I don't understand. I thought, it's like not a big deal, but perhaps it's because people would more likely view the vaccine as the saving grace.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, that was his ego. I mean, he wanted he wanted that to be a political win. I don't know if he
mhm,
really cared about public health or anything like that, but he
right,
definitely wanted that to be a public health win, because again, a big part of the election, the second election, was he wasn't handling the pandemic well, and
right,
there was political opportunism, involved in this. I'm not saying he was like invested in the science or anything. I'm saying he
yeah,
was doing this for political.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So yeah, exactly. It's a solid win.
yeah,
I'm the president who
yeah,
brought the vaccine.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, oh, totally
yeah.
get that. Um, so with regards to the findings, y'all found some really interesting stuff. I have them
Mhm,
right down here. So a lot of it was looking at political conservatism and risky pandemic lifestyles. And again, we all focused on empathy, authoritarian beliefs, and risk. Feelings of risk for the pandemic
mhm,
more so, which I think is interesting. Looking at the more personal, like how did the pandemic impact my personal health or finances versus society as a
mhm,
whole. So it's
mhm,
like just going through it, it's kind of coming to me that how do people, if big picture, right? Pandemic, they're blowing it out of proportion, right? It's, this, that, or what have you. But, you got laid off. So that huge, I was just kind of wondering, would people have that kind, would they still associate that with with the pandemic? Basically, it cost me my job, but
mhm,
it's really, not that big of a problem that everyone's making out. They're just trying to perhaps I know some people would say control me, one way or another, or just you know be trying to influence my life, how I don't like it. So you know you want to talk, what do you have to say about that?
mhm,
Or even if it's not
mhm.
finances, families, right, are the
Yeah.
huge thing, and people, y'all looked quite a bit in some of the other articles as well,
Mhm.
mobility, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
versus staying at home.
Mhm.
So family life, I was kind of that kind of dual nature of pandemic, not a huge threat,
Mhm.
that you have family members that are, you know, that got seriously ill from it or
Yeah.
potentially died. So what are, any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, this first project was, was really trying to advance kind of what we knew about uh, uh, this idea that conservatives were not were like kind of living these risky pandemic lifestyles, and by pandemic lifestyles I mean not sanitizing, not social distancing, not wearing masks, not vaccinating. So thinking about all of those things you could do, to protect to potentially protect yourself during a pandemic. There was pretty consistent evidence coming out
Mhm.
showing that political conservatives that could be indexed by your political ID being a Republican, identifying as a conservative, um, uh, you know being exposed to right wing media sources like Fox News, or also just being a Trump supporter. So you can think about all these different ways. We wanted to know why. We want to know why. Okay, yes, okay, conservatives are living these risky pandemic lifestyles, but what is explaining that? And that's really what this paper was about. And we kind of centered on these three potential pathways: empathy, authoritarianism, and perceived threat. I think perceived threat, the one that you were kind of emphasizing there, is probably the most uh, the one that received the most attention. And it was this idea that conservatives, uh, were not perceiving the pandemic as serious as other people. And the reason for that is that they were getting messages from
Mhm.
their political leaders calling into question whether or not the pandemic was real. And that's what's so fascinating from a sociological perspective and a political scientist perspective, in the sense that these elite political cues had such a major impact on the population in the middle of a pandemic, right? So that was like one of the big ones, that conservatives, were not as threatened by the pandemic, and that's why they didn't kind of have the motivation to be social distancing, wearing masks, and getting vaccinated. They didn't have that kind of motivation. The other pathways were kind of less well known, I think. The empathy one was interesting because before our studies, there was actually a long line of research linking political conservatism with lower empathy and lower compassion, right? And that just centers around this idea that they emphasize personal responsibility more, and so they're less concerned with the well-being of others,
Right.
right? But I do want to say this: this does not mean that political conservatives don't have the capacity for compassion. It's like they tend to have lower compassion. There's plenty of conservatives that have high compassion. They have compassion for their loved ones and so forth. But if you
Mhm.
just ask a general question about caring for others who are suffering and that type of thing,
Mhm.
they will tend to score lower, right? And the idea there is that if people care less about the welfare of others, they'll be less likely to do pandemic health behaviors, which are about protecting you, but they're also about protecting other people. And again, it's another issue that about their motivation um, uh, there. Um, I also want to say this, something we're going to talk about a little bit later. Even though political conservatism is associated with religion, is
Mhm.
associated with higher levels, which
Oh,
is something to think about. Which is something to think about because there's that relationship there between conservatism and religion that we'll
oh,
talk.
yeah.
And the third pathway was authoritarianism. And that's really just the fact that political conservatives are more comfortable with this idea of law and order concentrating power into the hands of a single authoritarian leader, right? Problem is that authoritarian leader objected to or conflicted with the public health messaging, right? Because
Mhm.
that authoritarian leader wants to be the voice on public health, didn't really care about what CDC was saying, right? So that disconnect, right?
Mhm.
um, um, Produce that association between authoritarianism and a riskier pandemic, or the concentration of power on order, saying that we don't, some of these items that we actually measured were actually kind of scary to think about how many Americans agree with the statement that is a strong leader who doesn't have to worry about democracy and elections. It is amazing to think about that. But those people who believe that, they are not following the public health guidelines, and it's because they are following a single voice and it really does show the power of these of that elite.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And no, it's again, it's all fascinating. I know sometimes
Yeah,
scary.
yeah,
Like again, how impactful this person, right? This
yeah,
voice is.
yeah.
You know, history shows we've seen plenty of them. But part of it, when I was reading this article, reminded me of McCarthyism, right?
Uh-huh.
And at least until he got on camera, then it all got shot.
Hmm.
But and yes, I liked how you kind of alluded to, and I'm
Hmm.
super excited
Hmm.
to get to a little later in the
Hmm.
discussion. But religion, right?
Hmm.
Because talk about high, authority,
Hmm.
right? And especially when that intertwines with political authority, that how they meshed together, super wow, just incredible.
Hmm.
But so as we make our way there,
Hmm.
the next one of the biggest, kind of lean on to this the next article, conservatism and infrequent mask usage, right? So perhaps one of the biggest, if not the biggest, besides even going out, is the pandemic behavior is wear a mask, not to wear a mask, when can you wear it, and where people, right? I remember may have been a year ago when they were saying, oh, technically you should be double masking, and at that
Hmm.
point people more or less just scoffed at that, and they're
Hmm.
like, yeah,
It was
no.
you don't have to wear a mask, then you should wear a mask, then you should wear two masks.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was like there was we had mixed messaging from public health and government officials entire pandemic.
and
Yeah,
and not to
yeah,
mention the whole, well, what kind of mask
yeah,
should it be,
yeah,
right? Because there, tons of companies, for better or for worse, made a huge profit
yeah,
selling masks, and
yeah.
some of these masks didn't actually
Hmm.
do anything, right?
Hmm.
Or it's like, oh, I'm wearing a face, the face shields, all those kind of things, and they're
Hmm.
like, those help, but only in conjunction with a
Hmm.
mask. They don't replace it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
our mass study didn't really make any necessary claims about the benefits of masks because you are right.
Mhm.
You had the N95 mask that seemed to work really well, but does seem to be some questions about other types of masks. But I think for us, the important thing here was that this was a public health recommendation.
Mhm.
So it is interesting to see which segments of society. In this case, we were like actually looking at county level data, so we weren't looking at individuals anymore,
Right.
but looking at like which county populations were masking up more than others, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
well, and
yeah,
especially, y'all,
yeah,
mentioned or emphasized the three pillars, and one
yeah,
of which we
yeah,
already talked about,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
is
yeah,
Republican political leadership, like
yeah.
that specific leadership. So, how, and it's not just, at the time, President Trump,
Hmm.
it was governors,
Yeah,
right?
yes,
So, how were, you know, governors emphasizing, and especially, did you see anything, or what did you see rather, for those, say, if it was a Democratic governor, especially in states where they were, a lot closer as far as like, you know, huge Trump voters,
hmm,
as well as Republican governors like Florida, versus more, uh, what, when they say what political, like, battleground states.
yeah, yeah. So you know, um, you can see kind of layers of political authority, and you can have the federal authority, which was essentially represented by Trump, and then you had the state authorities that were essentially represented by these governors. And I think a lot of the Republican governors took their cues from Trump as a leader because having a battle with Trump was something that was like good for the Republican governor. But you also have some Republican governors of blue states that complicated some of this
Mhm.
in terms of their disagree with Trump and but still politically viable in their own state. And some of these these Republican government states are actually really, so there was some complexities there. But the main finding was really about counties that
Mhm.
had majority support for Trump essentially. So if Trump essentially pretty share of support county in terms of um, uh, then they less likely to mask up or had higher rates of infant mask usage, right? And so that's at a
Mhm.
population level. First study we talked about was level. It's really interesting to think about when you start to move up to the county level, you start to see um, county populations characterized by political conservatism or Trump support in particular. Um, so following your terms of the mask usage.
Yeah, and on that, you even, again, looked at, what kind of religious denominations,
Mm-hmm.
and predominantly y'all looked at Protestantism, and I think one of your other studies as well, you also looked at evangelicals, but really again, we were kind of talking about that, added power to authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, there's going to be certain rhetoric, and that seemed to be a major role is like, what are the phrases to use? We also talked about what some might say, like, if you deviated or even went against what, Trump was saying at that time, then they'd be like, oh, that's political
Mm-hmm.
suicide. Or I saw recently an ad or a campaign ad, one of the states up north, but now they're talking, calling them rhinos,
Yeah,
Republicans in
and
name
name only.
only. And it's fascinating. Like
Yeah.
that whole thing's come about just because, like, it's, well, you're not for Trump, again, it's, to me, it is really interesting just that you could have such a divide from within.
Mm-hmm.
And again, then all this, we're going to talk about media consumption, um, how that just essentially it exacerbates the issue,
Mm-hmm.
the infrequent, like it justifies my, right beliefs. And part of it is like, are these individuals, right, or at least, especially as this study is concerned, these larger counties, states, are they going in with these beliefs, right? Are they getting impacted? And then you hear basically this kind of information. And I even was questioning, reminding me of like more egregious, super far right media, QAnon,
Mm-hmm.
good old Alex Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Like, does that make people, might start off as like, yeah, follow Trump, but does that perhaps make them more vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
or to start going down, what we deem conspiracy theories?
So what we learned in the first study when we actually directed personal right wing media consumption, we did include right wing media consumption, Fox News, OAN, some of these
Hmm.
uh, sources. And what we found is there's actually kind of an inconsistent association at the individual level between the right wing media consumption, pandemic lifestyles. And really, what was driving it was your Republican identification, identifying as a conservative, and then and support for Trump. The right wing media consumption was very inconsistently related. And basically, what that suggests to us is that even though we had a lot of concern about the misinformation about the pandemic and about health lifestyles that was being pushed by Fox News and related sources, basically there's not really it's unlikely to have a causal relationship to any of your behaviors. It's really just a selection that certain political people with certain political views are drawn to those media sources, but it's those previous political views they bring um, uh, to those media sources that then echo what they already kind of believe, right?
Right.
And so really there's no association, really no clear association between right wing media consumption and pandemic lifestyles after you account for if somebody is a Republican, is a conservative, essentially. So,
Right.
so that is some conflicting evidence between our two studies. The study we're talking about now at the county level,
Hmm.
we did find that Google searches for Fox News, for example, interest in Fox News was associated with lower mask usage, right, at the county level. But our individual level study says that that personal right wing media consumption, isn't really doing much. So
Wow.
this is the complexities and contradictions between even studies that I've produced,
Hmm.
right? And why it's always important. Makes theoretical sense to look at the individual level if you're aggregate level. Um, so that I think what we can really hang our hat on is that there's something about political conservatism, there's something about religious conservatism, conservative Protestantism, evangelical Christianity, Christian nationalism, maybe talk about.
Hmm.
There's something about those that are consistently related to your pandemic lifestyles. Media consumption, in my opinion, is inconsistent. Is
Okay.
inconsistent.
and I wonder if that's because, again, kind of made mention at the
Yeah.
start of the stream is social media, right? It's
Yeah.
like, so I have a TV in
Yeah.
my house, but I never use it to actually watch TV, right?
Mhm.
Any sort of information consumption is more or less off my phone
Yeah.
or off the laptop, right?
Yeah.
It's, I know most media, Fox News, CNN, all that, they try and do small clips, trying to
Yeah.
change the game, but
Yeah.
I wonder if that's in part why, because they don't have the kind of
That
traction, or it's for
mhm.
perhaps mainly still just a certain demographic. Perhaps it's older Americans.
Yeah, that could be, that could be another interesting way of measuring kind of media consumption, because we asked like what was
Mhm.
your major source of news. We did allow for people to write in if they didn't
Okay.
identify with like major networks, right?
Hmm.
And so some people did write in like Alex Jones and right, was it Drudge Report, some other
Oh
ones,
yeah.
and so we like kind of hand coded some of these as right wing media consumption.
Mm.
But you're right. I think that could always do a better job of capturing. You could do a whole study on just different types of media consumption,
Yeah.
different styles of media consumption. Because you're right, maybe people that focus on the TV maybe get certain types of messages. People that focus on internet maybe get certain.
Hmm.
Then also you have people like my dad that focuses on radio.
Oh yeah.
That gets
Yeah.
information from the radio,
Hmm.
and and maybe where you're getting it, it not it's not it's it does kind of lead you to certain types of voices that you may not hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not to mention if it's like on internet, or
Yeah.
even I know there's some on like
Yeah.
Snapchat.
Yeah.
It's like, here's your
Yeah.
news in under 2 minutes. Here's
Yeah.
all the big things. Okay, great. I'm all
Yeah.
caught up with what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
Is also comment sections, right? And
Yeah.
of course, I I urge caution anyone delving into the comment sections,
Mhm.
because it gets nasty real fast.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think that's, to me, that's like, yeah, real interesting. Is there a difference on impact based on the kind of like how you consume your media? I think that's awesome. And real fast, I just want to say, chat, if y'all have questions, feel free to post them, and I'll do my best to constantly monitoring. And for myself or for Dr. Hill, please feel free. And just want to give that little shout out. And okay, so now, of course, y'all can kind of see where I'm really privy and interested in is you talked about Christian
Yeah.
nationalism, and it got brought up in this study. So how does Christian nationalism, really, impact these beliefs? Like, how has that really gone hand in
So
hand?
I haven't published anything directly on that,
Hmm.
but I have looked at it in our data, and
Okay.
I have read at least one study. And I'll just tell you that one study that I read that was actually published, they did show a robust association between Christian nationalism and risky pandemic lifestyles. Um, I confirm that with my data, although I have not published those yet. But I'm just
Okay.
saying I believe something that Christian nationalism. And I think that just centers around. I mean, Christian nationalism is kind of like a kind of an authoritarian movement to
Mhm.
kind of turn the U.S. back to some sort of Christian ideal tree, right? So I think there's a skepticism. There's a concern about secularization in our society.
Right.
There's a concern about big government. I think, although I think they would be happy to have a big Christian, laws and things like that.
Yeah. I,
Um,
yeah. And yeah, it's, so I think we're going to start seeing a lot more studies, publications, because I'm, personally really interested
yeah,
in how that goes. And uh, chat, everyone watching, we're kind of already starting to see this. You get questions regarding, or pushes rather for bringing even the Bible back into schools,
hmm
doing prayer,
hmm
right? So I think it is kind of these individuals who are naturally like no to big government.
yeah.
But if big government all of a sudden was, really intertwined with, religion, then all of a sudden it's like, well, no, okay, maybe it's not all so
I mean,
bad.
that's the great hypocrisy of all of the entire political spectrum. It's
Hmm.
like people are against authoritarianism unless it's serving their interests, unless it's serving their political interests. And I think that's not Republican. same kind of hypocrisy.
Hmm.
That as long as the government is serving their interests, they're okay with.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
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 it's really fascinating
yeah,
stuff, kind of
yeah.
to see what kind of comes from it. Um, so I guess y'all briefly talked about potential strategies that might be implemented that would help these individuals or just people in general
Yeah,
adhere to public health guidelines because believe it or not, they're still out there.
yeah.
CDC, WHO are still publishing things, but by and large, it seems, and this is just from my perspective, a lot of people kind of are like, oh yeah, pandemic's over,
Yeah,
more or
yeah,
less, right? Like
yeah.
most people are not masking.
Mhm.
So like, are there any strategies that you think of that maybe y'all discussed in the article or that's occurred since the publication of this article?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm not formally trained in public health interventions,
Hmm.
so I'm going to leave that to them. But I will say this: I mean, we do call for, we do think that this type of research can help point to some ways that we can start thinking about interventions. If if there's a political messaging issue, that how do we documented that? How do we intervene? Um, to kind of snap that spell.
Mm,
How do we cut the religion, conservative religion, essentially?
right.
And basically, we're calling for interventions that kind of directly focus on that. To me, what I would do, and again, I have no formal training, so don't take anything say serious too seriously, but I think this is reasonable. You know, why don't we find Republicans and conservative Protestants that are actually sympathetic to public health and public health science, and like figure out a way, collaborate with them to figure out ways of messaging.
Mm,
And I don't even know if that would even work, but like they might know how to talk to their group in
hmm.
a way that would allow us to better communicate and to maybe make them less defensive or less insecure about following public health guidelines. But we still have to. That doesn't solve the problem
Hmm.
that their friends are Republicans, their friends are conservative, and they will judge you
Yeah.
for getting vaccinated. You're a sheep,
Yeah.
right? Sheeple. They'll judge you for wearing a mask. They will judge you.
Yeah.
I mean, when I go visit my family in East Texas, walking around with a mask earlier in the pandemic, people were not wearing masks and staring at me, and it
Hmm.
was pretty clear like what was going on. Like,
Right.
and it can be intimidating. There's a social control element that it's like, how do you
Hmm.
change the social control element, even if you have these individualistic ways of figuring out a way to talk to people, some messages. To me, it all comes back to the
I
institutions.
was gonna say, yeah, the
Yeah,
mistrust.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to say this, and again, I'm not a public health
Hmm.
scholar, even though I publish in public health journals. But I will say this: public health as an institution has been a monumental failure during the pandemic. They have failed us at every turn. Mixed messages about the masking. About I still cannot believe that public health did not know what to do with schools.
Yeah, and even the whole
Yeah,
shutdowns
yeah,
in general. I
yeah,
remember that
yeah.
was a
When to
huge
shut down? Yeah, yeah.
contentious.
When to shut down? Who should stay? Who should be staying at home?
Mhm.
Hiding information about vaccines. Just releasing bits of information about vaccines. I mean, it's just you enter in the conflicting interests of big pharma, and we
Mhm.
just we don't really trust public health. And this
Yeah.
isn't just about Fauci. We don't trust the institution
Right.
of public health that they have our interests in mind. I personally was ignorant of how connected the White House was to CDC. I thought that those were independent,
Yeah.
and I did not understand until I started during the Trump administration. You started hearing this that the White House was monitoring the communications of the CDC to us
Hmm.
and shaping them. I didn't know that. I thought they were kind of independent. I thought the government funded them,
Right.
but they were independent. So
You're
yeah,
not alone.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then right, because then Trump fired and
yeah,
replaced right the head of the
yeah,
CDC, which
yeah.
of course I was like, I thought this is a institute kind of in its own right. I
Yeah,
didn't know he had that power, but
it
that's
was
to.
constantly fighting. It was constantly
Hmm.
fighting with people in the CDC, with Fauci in particular. That well,
Yeah.
um, but so the public health, as represented by the CDC, looks incompetent
Hmm.
because of all the mixed messages. And frankly, it's been very clear that they have this idea that they instead of giving us the information and letting us as knowledgeable citizens, they believe that the best way to handle the population is to lie and manipulate us, and that is not a good strategy. Um, uh, that in the politicization,
Mm,
the fact that they are kind of connected to whoever might be in the White House,
right.
and you saw this again with during the Biden administration, the public health guidelines around like flight attendants, how long the flight attendants would have to stay home after a positive test. That was
Mm,
changed because
yeah.
the industry was lobbying the White House to change like how long you need to stay home after an infection.
Yeah. Well,
You know, yeah,
not just to mention, yeah, I think it
yeah,
was during that when they came out, the most recent with, if you test
yeah,
positive, how
yeah.
long do you have to quarantine for? It's
Yes.
and people are like, oh, it's now only like 5 days.
See, yeah. Why
But
does that change? It seems very
yeah.
arbitrary, and
Hmm.
really, what that was the result was like, certain industries were lobbying the White House to cut those down because they need their workers back. And so, there's a major like I keep coming back to this. There's an institutional problem here with the government and with public health institutions and medicine and big pharma, a lack of mistrust and a lack of um, confidence in their competence and whether or not they're actually representing the interests of public health and public safety.
Oh yeah.
And to me, that's where it all really needs to go back to, because
Right.
we're never going to be able to give messages, I think, that will give people the courage to resist their families and to resist their friends who are Republican,
Mhm.
conservative, Protestant. People will question, you know, political allegiance.
Right.
They'll question your faith.
Hmm. Yeah. It is. It gets scary. I agree with you. It's that mistrust, which again, of course, people are going to be looking for that information. If you don't trust the institution who's there, it's people always the whole meme now. It's like you had one job. But what happens if the institute, who's that's their job, you don't trust them? And then I think this is where it gets to and start listening to someone who seems to have all the answers. Whether, I think this is why you've seen such a huge rise in conspiracy theory sites. Again, the whole QAnon, Alex Jones,
Oh yeah.
and it's really like again scary, fascinating. It's how I describe a lot of the stuff.
Well,
Chat knows
this,
in
well,
sociology.
well, this, I mean, this idea, this cynical view that you cannot trust people with with true information, even if it's just basic scientific information. You're
Mhm.
right. It is like widespread in terms of trying to censor social media, censor the internet, what we could possibly see, and that's not going to go well. That all
Yeah.
that does is feed back into conspiracy theories because
Hmm.
it seems like the government. I mean, it's pretty clear right now to me. The government is indirectly limiting free speech by censoring, by having social media companies censor
Hmm.
online posts and certain political speech that's inconsistent with government narratives.
Yeah.
And this is all stemming from the same kind of cynical perspective that you cannot trust the people,
Mhm.
and you cannot trust your neighbor.
Right.
And when, in my opinion, trust should be directed.
Right. So, and it's fat. I'm reading chats, getting some stuff. Yeah, saying it's all about the money, and that yeah. One said you shouldn't be able to lobby against the science and the facts of
Oh,
transmission.
amen.
But yeah, right. It's because again, think about it, you have this mistrust, and then you get caught, which he did get caught quite a
Yes,
bit,
yes.
messing with like what gets released, and all of a sudden it's like, man, maybe Alex Jones was onto something, right? And
There's a saying that some of the misinformation or conspiracy theories, the difference between some of the misinformation and conspiracy theories and the truth is about 2 weeks.
yep. I haven't heard that one before. I
Yeah,
like it. Yeah, it's
and they'll never apologize. The media will never apologize.
oh,
For people that suggested that the vaccines were not stopping brain infections or something like that. Because there was a lot of misinformation of CDC about the effectiveness of these vaccines. That they said it will prevent you from transmitting the infection or being reinfected, things like that. Early
mhm,
on, they were saying those things. People that said that questioned that were like vilified online, and those people that vilified them have not apologized after the fact. Now that we know more, that
mhm.
these vaccines do allow for breakthrough infections and don't prevent you from spreading it, so forth.
Yeah, it's sad, and
Yeah,
it just frankly it's just
yeah,
reinforcing this huge political divide, which like it was growing over the past few years, but and ever since, I
And this
think
is just the newest manifestation. The health,
right.
the pandemic lifestyles, doesn't it just show you like everything is political now, right?
Yes, everything.
Down to, and this is what really fascinates me about this. Um, Behaviors that like sanitizing, wearing a mask, getting vaccinated that could protect you from dying from a pandemic. Like we're willing to die
Yeah, it's
on that hill
yeah.
for our political beliefs, for our religious beliefs.
Mhm. And it's and this is a discussion I've had with chat and
Yeah,
even my family many a times now
yeah,
is like this whole idea that everything has to be politicized. I'm like,
yeah,
when something happens,
yeah,
nationally, it's almost like everyone's waiting. Like, okay, wait, what do the comments say? What side should I be? Should I be pro this thing or should
yeah,
I be against it?
yeah.
Um,
And it makes people not want to talk.
yeah, yeah,
You
that
know,
discussion because it's like, oh man, I don't want to be judged or like or
you
do the
tell me
judging,
this.
right?
Do you think that, have you noticed? I feel like my in class discussions have just getting more and more constrained. Fewer and fewer people want to talk because I think they're exhausted by like by some of this this contention. I will say this. This goes back to what we were saying earlier, that there, I think all of this, the conspiracy stuff and all of the politicization and the culture wars, it's about a search for meaning. We are all
Mm,
searching for meaning because our institutions have failed. Our institutions used to do a better job of like of socializing us and providing order in the world that we live in,
mhm,
and being a source of credible information. It wasn't credible, but we had a belief in it and a confidence in it, in
right.
the order. And I think when that falls away, there is like a power vacuum, there's an information vacuum, there's a
Mhm,
meaning crisis. And that's really what's going on right now. And that's why like how I interpret all of the conspiracy theories and a lot of this stuff, this like anti-government stuff and
mhm.
so forth. A lot of this is like people are searching for meaning because they don't know who to turn to now,
Yeah.
because the government is incredible to them or the CDC is incredible to them or something.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with that. I like the idea of, and it is what it is. It's
Yeah.
a power vacuum. I attribute it to like, oh man, the teen pop stars like, Disney. It's like, all right, who they got going? They have the Jonas Brothers. All right, Jonas Brothers too old now. Like they leave. There's an empty spot. Like someone has to fill it. They
Yeah.
have to keep it going. So
Yeah.
it's like you got to find the next pop star. So in the more serious sense, though, it's absolutely right. If I want this information. And if I can't get it from what the supposed places are, well, one, why is that?
Mm.
And then two, it's not like, okay, I guess I'll just go about ignorance and bliss
Yeah.
and go about my own day. It's like, no, people want to know, they want to be
Especially during a
informed.
pandemic when you think that your
Yeah.
life might be in jeopardy.
Yeah. Because they're like, what, because I have, pretty much everyone I'm sure knows or has vulnerable family that you're like, oh God, it's like, do I need to keep, how long do I need to keep them in shelter?
Hmm.
Like perhaps I traveled. What are the precautions I have to take? And you're right. Then you start getting all this misinformation, and then you get, family, they're one way or the other, right? It's like, oh, you'll be fine. It's hard, Republican, right? It's no, you don't need to wear that mask. Breathe that freedom air.
Hmm.
It's fine. Or, you know, contrarily, on the other side, it's like, oh my God, are you trying to, kill us because you're
Hmm.
not taking the safety precautions? Yeah,
Hmm.
the judgment, and I know you got blasted on the media, like
Hmm.
people getting into fights, being extremely
Yeah.
condescending or
Hmm.
whatnot, based on the health behaviors where frankly, these should not be fights at all.
Yeah.
It should all just,
Especially about the mask. Like I
yeah.
kind of understand the people that are concerned about being forced to get a vaccine, put something in their body, because like if this bodily autonomy, before the pandemic was actually a thing that the left believed in, for example,
Hmm.
and it seems inconsistent. Um, you if you're going to support mandatory vaccinations and things like that.
Right.
But like when you're talking about something like masks, I agree. I don't understand why people care.
Yeah.
Like, why do people care? Like, if I wear a mask, like, why do you care?
Yeah.
I don't get it. I don't get it. It seems like such a innocuous thing to me. And but again, this is all part of why this is fascinating.
Right.
And I'll tell you one thing: the answer to that question, why do people care, has nothing to do with biology. It's about there's about like the social
Hmm.
construction of masks, but
Hmm.
the meaning that we give to masks, and that's like the how sociologists contribute to these discussions, that public health have difficulty wrapping their minds, that
Right.
medical scientists have difficulty never be able to really understand. These are social and cultural problems.
Yeah. Oh,
You know,
100%. Right. It's like the mask itself is completely politicized. Right. And again, you're right. It's not about biology, so to say.
yeah,
Like I could be a, like, hey, yeah, if I catch this, like I might die. But people see
yeah.
the mask and it's like, oh, he's not.
And,
They're not thinking, oh, he must be vulnerable or something. It's like,
yeah.
ugh,
And can I say
he's
also, like, they
yeah.
used to not be, because I don't know if you remember this, but there was some old focus on the family pamphlets, or some conservative religious organization, some pamphlets from the 80s during the pandemic, uh,
Oh,
uh, and basically were like, they had pictures of these conservative Protestants wearing masks to protect themselves from AIDS. And it's like, and it's
whoa.
so it just shows you that, like, that the stigma of masks can change over time,
Hmm.
as kind of the meaning systems, the meanings that we give these masks can change over time. And you know
That's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's really
yeah,
interesting. That'd be a cool little comparative
yeah,
study of like pandemic behaviors during
yeah,
like which is
yeah.
like it's about 40ish years ago. Not
Well, it's funny you said that, because like my master student right now is trying to do a thesis that compares media representations of the Spanish flu with the current pandemic, and looking for similar themes. What were the political themes? Were there any religious themes? Was there controversy about masks during the Spanish flu? And so he's doing a historical archive analysis to try to make these contrasts. Right. He better be
yeah, it better
professor.
be
Yeah,
right. It better be doing work.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Man, that's so
Isn't
cool.
it, to see what
Yeah,
the continuities are?
yeah.
Were there similar types of themes about immigrants, for example?
Mm,
Or we haven't really even talked about that, the China, the anti-Chinese thing or whatever.
right,
But yeah, I think that's going to be a fascinating examination just to read, because we don't know much about. I don't know much about the Spanish flu,
right,
and you said earlier, just the history of it,
hmm,
the fact that it didn't come from Spain.
right.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
just
yeah,
goes to
yeah,
show
yeah.
because I'm of course
But that's a similar thing, isn't that
yeah.
we're uncertain about the origins of COVID,
Hmm.
just like there was certainty about the Spanish flu in terms of its origins as well.
Right, and but now it's like in the history
Yeah,
books of like
yeah,
because of
yeah,
course I've heard of the Spanish
yeah,
flu before all this
yeah,
happened, but of course I'm like, oh, I guess it originated from Spain.
yeah.
No,
No,
no, no,
Kansas,
Kansas, yeah,
Yeah, no, it was
yeah,
Kansas. Yeah,
yeah. It's
yeah,
like oh, what but again, it just goes to show you. So I think that's cool doing those
yeah,
kind of historical, kind of comparative analyses just
yeah,
to see how do people react.
yeah.
Um, like again, for even the AIDS pandemic and Spanish flu, was there this kind of political divide in the U.S. that we're seeing now? Was that something similar back then? I'm very curious. I'd
Yeah.
love to like know more
So
about
would
that.
I. I can't
It's
wait to read
yeah, right.
it.
And you mentioned something earlier too with regards about classroom discussions.
Yeah.
By and large, I want to say um, yes. So especially when I was teaching at, I also taught at the University of Texas, San Antonio, for a few years. Especially with the larger classes, especially once this hit,
Mm,
discussion was essentially dead. Let alone if it was online, like any sort of online component, synchronous. I'm giving a lecture over Zoom. I mean, absolutely no discussion. What usually I could prod and like get a few, students talking, but between the online component and like you said, like people are even more afraid now more than ever uh, being judged,
mm-hmm.
students. And of course, even as a professor, I don't know if you've experienced this. I'm like, okay, I have to walk on more eggshells now. Like, I don't want to do a pandemic fight because I'm
It
like,
crosses my mind. And
right.
we have the state legislature talking about, going to be talking about like fragility or something.
Oh,
And
yeah. Yeah.
it has crossed my mind, and I have considered changing my courses, cutting certain topics.
Mhm.
Um, and it does seem to be a general exhaustion uh, part of students not want to engage in anything too contentious, maybe,
Right.
unless, I don't know. I mean, I think it seems general. I mean, don't
Mhm.
get me wrong, like every
Right.
class you'll have some students that I had another colleague, who wanted to talk about the national polling on the use of Latinx, for example. And
Oh, yeah.
apparently over 90% of Latinos prefer that term,
Right. I've heard that.
and
Yeah.
yet it's still kind of being pushed kind of elite institutions, and this and she tried to talk about this in one of her courses, and the students were like not responsive.
It just
And it seemed to me, it seems very fascinating that this language that's being presented to us. It's very unpopular language, and it just seems very interesting. And students are not interested in talking about that either. Yeah,
it,
yeah.
the last, so I taught a sociological theory course last summer, but I was at a different university, much smaller class, and it's almost interesting. It just shows you, between a huge
Mm-hmm.
public university versus private, these students had more or less, you know, grown up, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
together
Mm-hmm.
going through
Mm-hmm.
undergrad. So they all, to an extent, knew one another.
There was
And
about trust, so they could feel like they talk more or something like that.
yeah, and like they already kind of know like what this person like, so just for some context, chat, when I teach at UTSA, my classes oftentimes would be at least 100 students. So there's a lot of,
And I had some bigger ones. Mine were bigger too.
so
Like that. Yeah.
you had to deal with the big
Yeah.
one. Yeah,
Yeah.
and of course, I mean, I remember being a student. It's like I don't want to talk in front of 100 other right? Because it's that fear. But
Mm-hmm.
this smaller class that I taught, this theory, I was surprised how much I was able to get them. Like it'd usually be a little bit perhaps of a tough start to get them going, but once they got it going, it was like we were actually engaging in these fantastic discussions. However, we were still like, at least I was always trying to steer it away from, hey, let's not do this political topic, right?
So
Let's
they were actually, some students were actually pushing you that talk about some political.
yeah, they'd kind of bring it, and it's like, and of course I'm willing to talk about it, to the extent that knowledge that I know, or think about, or how does it relate to sociology. But of course there's a fine line between, okay, is we still talking the academic scientific sense, or now it's like, I always call it family time. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, my insert family member or
Yeah.
something, is like, I was like, okay, now we're like no longer necessarily scientific, like it's getting too personal.
It's
So
awkward to shut that down, isn't it?
it is.
Yeah.
Oh
I
man,
had
it's
somebody last semester, student trying to tell the class that vaccines could kill something, and I did like, it's like how to nicely say without embarrassing the student, and the student from the whole
right.
class, say like, I don't, just it's hard to manage some of
The
this stuff.
believe it or not, everyone listening in,
Yeah.
like there's an art to
Yeah.
this. Yeah,
Yeah.
most, at least myself, I usually won't straight up tell someone no. I'm like, that's a really interesting point of view, or
Yeah.
right? You find these ways to
You have to manage a
move
lot
it.
of emotions,
You
manage a
do.
lot of people's feelings, and
Yeah.
easy to do. You want it to be seamless and flow,
Right.
and everybody to feel welcome. It's just true wars. It takes something so hard to step on some of those
Yeah.
minds.
Yeah, and it just seems like there's more and more constantly.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
all right, on this next week, but what's the big topic that I'm trying to avoid? Absolutely, it's difficult. Um, so kind of, we talked about mobility, right?
Yeah.
People going out versus people staying at home.
Yeah.
And I love the title of this article. So the
Yeah.
nastiest question: does
Yeah.
population mobility vary by state political ideology during the novel coronavirus pandemic? So this idea that, we talked mostly about masks, but this is another huge behavior is people were still like, well, no, I still want to go, like, I still
Yeah.
want to go, I just still want to go
Yeah.
food. I don't want to
Yeah.
basically, shelter at home, but people are like, I don't want to, live shelter. Again, you have these two stark contrasting ideas of, right, this is America. I can go, wherever I want. You can't
Mm-hmm.
force me to, like, basically, some might see it as imprisoning themselves
Yeah.
at their own home,
Yeah.
versus others are like, again, this kind of goes back to perhaps that empathy factor. So really fascinating, and even now we're seeing the long-term effects of curbside pickup, for
Mm-hmm.
groceries, the food delivery.
I
Like,
love food.
I
That's
know
my
it's the best,
favorite.
isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
That's like, do I want to spend 45 minutes driving, or do I want someone else to spend
I
45
don't
minutes
care. They
driving?
can charge me whatever they want. They can charge me whatever
Just,
they want. I will pay them literally whatever they want. They can.
Yeah. So, silver linings
Mhm.
from this pandemic, in a lighter fashion. But I saw in this article that looks at mobility, right?
Yeah.
Y'all mentioned, at least at the time, right?
Yeah.
From I have it up here, the Coronavirus Resource Center,
Yeah.
dated 2020 at Johns Hopkins, that over 250,000 Americans had died, which contributes to 20% of all verified COVID deaths, when the U.S. only accounts for 4%
Yeah.
of the population. So
That's
I just
over a
thought that
million now, by the way.
it's over a million
Over a
now.
million U.S. deaths due
Wow.
to coronavirus, and it's still a similar percentage. It's still a disproportionate
Yeah.
share of deaths. We should have closer to 4% of the deaths, but we have a much higher percentage of that. That reflects the failures of our public health institutions,
Mhm.
our medical institutions, our poor healthcare system that leaves so many uncovered, and the politicization of it. It really
Right.
does. The unique social and structural context and resource environments of our country really put us at a unique disadvantage relative to even poorer countries.
Wow. That and so I'm curious. Do you know, at least even now, like what's the kind of rate or percentages for like the country like right under us? Do you know?
I don't
Okay.
remember that. I just because I was focusing on the U.S.,
Hmm.
but I just remember that's still consistent today. That we have a disproportionate. Yes, but that's very much consistent with the public health embarrassment that this country has. You think of health, uh,
Yes.
uh, you know, black white mortality gap, so forth. There's so or over
Uh, the prison.
yeah,
Yeah.
over the prison. Like we take more medicines than other countries do, more antidepressants than other countries do, so forth. We have a population um, environment for as much as we spend on healthcare, um, health outcomes are not. And pandemic is just this manifestation of that.
Hmm.
We have a healthcare system that is on the edge. It's always on the edge.
Yeah.
There's just enough beds, just enough masks, there's just enough medicine, and but if we have any, because that's the most efficient economic strategy
Oh yeah.
in terms of streamlining profits. But if you have any public health crisis, all of a sudden, we have to erect hospitals and parking garages, and there's not enough
Yeah.
masks for our frontline healthcare providers. There's
Yep.
not enough medicine or ventilators and things like that for healthcare, and they really let us down. They really let us down, and this goes back, president, to Obama had an opportunity to restore a lot of the public health stores of masks and things like that, and ventilators and things like that. He chose not to do that, and then of course Trump didn't do.
Yeah.
So this spans
Mhm.
um, political presidencies.
And you bring up a good point, and even in chat, they're kind of asking like, so even with all these factors, like always being on the edge, and and sometimes, frankly, just not being um, able to truly help. You know, why is healthcare still so expensive?
Yeah,
And of course, I think, just my knowledge is a lot of it goes back to insurance companies.
yeah, yeah,
Right. You also
yeah,
have big pharma.
yeah.
It's hiking up the price. Who is it? They called him the pharma bro, but it was this like Lex
Skrelly
Skrelly. Yes. This
went to
guy,
jail for
he,
that.
he is
Yeah,
in jail, but
yeah.
he's getting out relatively soon. But he can't work on the stock market for like 10 years, something like
Hmm.
he kind of got banned, which is so ridiculous. That's only 10 years, right? It
Yeah.
should be, you'd think they'd make it a lifetime.
Hmm.
So for those that don't know, individuals like this, who he got it as a life-saving medicine for those with, was it diabetes
Yeah, I think it was something like that, or
yes.
epi or something, pen or something like
Yeah, I
that.
think,
I
yeah.
don't know what it was.
So something, a pretty common medication
That there
that
was no alternative for.
and that's the
Yeah,
big thing. No
yeah,
alternative for it, and it was like $17 for dose or something like that. And he hiked it up. I forgot how many, like thousands of percents, to
yeah,
like over $700. And of course, you're like, well, the insurance will cover it, right? But this comes out to the problem is like, well, what if
yeah,
you don't have insurance?
yeah,
You're still expensive, but very affordable medication that you need. There's no
yeah.
alternative. Is now almost
Yeah,
$1,000.
that's a new pharma model. He's
Hmm.
not the only one to do this. You can find tons of examples where rich people come in, they buy a company, they find out that medication that there is no generic for, no alternative for, and they buy it and then increase the price 5,000% or something like that. Get a quick windfall, and when they start getting when the media gets wind of what's going on, that people can no longer afford their medication, and they
Yeah.
but that's just a quick scheme. But that goes to answer the question in the chat. This is all about our medicine is like our medical care, our healthcare, our pharmaceuticals, our medicines are all privatized. It's
Hmm.
all about profit. It's not about public good or public interest. If we had a healthcare system that was publicly funded, if
Hmm.
pharma was nationalized,
Yeah.
if the government, the federal government could actually uh, regulate price of drugs with the manufacturers, you could bring costs down. But to me, we have to be open with that. To me, healthcare and public health should be a public good, and we should not care if there's excess or waste. Like there should
Hmm.
be, like we should have. I'm okay of having an extra wing of a hospital that we rarely use unless there's an emergency, or if
Right.
we have extra ventilators that we never use unless there's an emergency, or if we have extra masks that we never use in case of emergency. I have
Yeah.
no problem with that.
Right.
But the only reason we do have a problem with that is because everything has to be about for profit.
Yeah.
If we remove the profit motive, and if it's
Hmm.
just about public safety and public health, then these excesses, these extra having the extra space, the extra um, protective equipment doesn't become a problem.
Yeah.
And but it's just somebody has to profit on everything,
Yeah.
and that's why everything costs so much.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, chat. I think that's a pretty solid answer, and
Yeah.
it really is. It's sad, and you even mentioned frontline workers, and even like them not having the necessary things. Well, my wife, she worked
Mm,
at a private hospital at the time when the pandemic, was coming out, and they had to use the same N95 mask
yeah.
for basically as long as they could. They'd actually get reprimanded if they had to replace it early, like because they didn't have it. And it's like one thing if like okay, you're just serving, but you are dealing with every patient you're dealing with basically has COVID. At one point, told me that their check-in desk, right, as
Hmm.
you do for the emergency room, there was no screening before then, right? So people are
Hmm.
coming up to your face and they're like, "Oh yeah, I think I have COVID," and it's just like zero precautions. But part of it was they didn't have the room.
Yeah.
They apparently didn't have the resources, which was borderline. I'm like criminal if we're because at this
Yeah.
point we still didn't know
Yeah.
what
It is.
COVID like all is it going to have long if you catch it, are there long term health implications, which I think we still are not entirely sure on, right?
Yep.
Because it
Yep.
hasn't been a long term. Like
Yep.
it's still
Yep.
technically going on. So it's
Yep.
like that to me was just complete ludicrous.
Yeah.
Just but like you said, it's like, well, it's we just didn't have it, and part of it is sometimes like it's not profitable. It's not that's stuff we'd have to replace. So it's
I wonder why
it's a
nurses
money
are
thing.
leaving the profession.
Y-
I wonder
Yeah,
why nurses are having serious mental health issues right now. I wonder
yeah,
why, because of the pandemic. I wonder.
yeah, and they're at an all-time low level. Like they've been talking. I'd love to see more studies on it.
Yeah.
Of yeah, they're nurses compassion, right? That
Mm.
big thing that you're really kind of just expecting when you go see like, hey, how can no, that's going out the door. Like
And
you
it's
are,
not a two-way street. It's not
yeah,
like you the way
mhm,
you're saying. I never heard that's really depressing. How they were kind of treated, by the hospital, being reprimanded or something if they don't fall if they don't mask right or something like that.
mhm.
Like it's not a two-way street. Like just nurses giving compassion, but where is the compassion for the nurses?
Usually, and again, this is just obviously personal experience, but by and large, it's not there, right? You think when you go, but a lot of people don't care because
Yeah.
right, they're upset that they're at the hospital to begin with.
Yeah.
They're let alone if it's like, oh, what do you mean I have to wear a mask? Like that's still a problem. Like in the emergency room, it's like, why am I so being told someone was the other day was upset that why am I so sick? And I'm like, well, you got COVID. And it's
Mm.
like, well, did you do the vaccine? Oh, everyone's always pushing me to do the vaccine. I was like,
Mm.
no, I'm not going to do like, stupid vaccine. It goes on this whole rant. They're like, basically, even the doctor was involved. We don't care, if you do or don't. Reason we ask is you asked us, why are you so sick? This is why you caught COVID, no vaccine. So you're getting the full brunt of it. You didn't want to hear any of it. And
Yeah.
so, and those kind of scenarios, it's just, and what it's I've just been being told is like there's zero, like you said, there's zero compassion coming
Yeah.
from um, patients. The administration, oftentimes, at least at this university, this new one that working at is a little better, but
Mhm.
they sometimes it's just like they look at you as nurses as cannon fodder, and I can tell you they had to step up and do a incentive program because travel nurses
Mm,
like were making
mm,
huge bucks.
mm,
And it's like, man, you know what, fine, if I don't like this place, I'm leaving after
mhm.
whenever my contract's up. And hospitals are starting to see it's like, oh, because it's like if you're not happy somewhere, then of course, yeah, I'm going to take the job and leave. And they're seeing huge growth, troves of people leaving.
Yeah.
So they had to change their method, but all of it does ultimately come back to is like, yeah, nurses just like teachers. Where's all the compassion you're doing for the kids?
Mhm.
It's like, man, because it's like people forgot how to socialize because of this whole pandemic, right?
Yeah.
And we're just it's really unfortunate. Like it
Mhm.
is kind of sad and is depressing to an extent just to see this whole lack of empathy, understanding. People are just like, yeah, just trying to go through the motions. Don't really necessarily see people as people.
And what would you do? You remember when the pandemic first started? Were you like one of those people? I had this hope that maybe that we would together, that there would be this division somehow during the pandemic, that we realized that like a lot of the stuff that we'd been bickering about was like stupid, and that we'd all come together. Did you have that feeling? I had this naive feeling that the pandemic would bring us together a
Hmm.
little bit. Not, it wouldn't
Yeah.
solve all the problems. Isn't it really interesting? Like I had that feeling. Some other
Mhm.
people, some other naive people I know had that feeling, but the opposite happened.
Yeah, that we need a national disaster to bring us
Yeah,
all together
I
and
thought
be
that's what it was
like,
gonna. I thought that's what it was gonna be. But
you would think, um it's one of those, if I was in, right, an alien race
yeah,
watching down, it's like, yeah, surely they're going to come together to combat this nope. Opposite. Even person in the chat's talking how patients kind of sticking on that,
mm.
more demanding, less forgiving. And I forgot, I'm glad this got brought up, that they've seen a rise in self-care encouragement from management.
Oh, the nurses.
Hmm.
Yeah, take care of yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
instead of providing support, it's like, well, if you need a day, then we'll give you a day.
Isn't that
But
just that's just neoliberalism and healthcare? It's like your personal responsibility.
Mhm.
We're not going to take any responsibility for your well being. I know as a hospital we're in a horrible position in finding your ability to actually take good care of your patients and making them wait for hours. And by the time they
Mhm.
get to you, they're really pissed. And you should take care of yourself. Good
Yeah,
luck.
yeah,
Good luck.
yeah, exactly. It's part of the job
Yeah.
you signed up for, right? Because you care for the pay. It's like, yeah, it's like that's that's more or less going out the window.
Yeah.
Like they're lucky to have like the amount that they still do, because
Hmm.
people are like, or even if you're doing patient care, a lot of nurses, I know quite a few now, like, yeah, I'm sick of bedside service or actual patient care, so one-on-one, it's like I'll go do the management, like
Uh huh.
I want to do management stuff, but like I don't want to see patients
Uh
anymore
huh.
because it's just gotten so bad. And these are from people who like started and right before COVID, super compassionate, loved
Hmm.
it, come home even if like
Hmm.
work conditions weren't fantastic, it wasn't nowhere near as horrendous as it now. I'm like, it's completely changed the game. Like
Yes, it
it's.
has, and I think that's generalizable. Like any type
Hmm.
of that compassion fatigue,
Hmm.
I think you can see it. Teachers and anybody who's like, I don't. We're just scratching the surface on
Yeah.
all compassion fatigue and loss. People that
Hmm.
have lost social isolation. So I don't. I mean, we're trying to get back out there
Yeah.
and go back to brunch, but it's just
There's a
yeah.
huge component, and the last question on
Yeah.
that I will ask is, what about in academia, like
Mhm.
fellow professors? Like
Yeah.
I remember I was there. It was like a ghost hall. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's it almost seems like a scary movie.
Yeah.
A chat context. It's a long hallway with doors, but all these
Uh-huh.
doors are now like closed. But and
Can I
I
tell
know,
you a creepy? Can I tell you just
yeah, yeah.
really quick a creepy story that I heard? So we just hired this woman. And she actually told me she looked up some history about the university
Oh.
before she came to the interview.
Mm-hmm.
You know how those hallways are like circuitous? It's like it looks like a labyrinth the way the hallways.
Yes.
Apparently, have you heard this story about there? It was intentional.
It was intentional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to suppress protest movements or something like that.
Yeah, because UTSA got built during the 60s. All the civil unrest. So if you ever visit the lovely campus, so it's all true. Concrete. Yeah. Oh,
that's crazy.
Yeah, and so the halls, the way the rooms are numbered is extremely confusing, and they're like,
and they're all windy.
It's windy, and it's honestly a lot of waste of space. Like, our fourth floor is a fifth of a floor. Like, utilize everything else, and you have classrooms up there. But it's professor, the relationships, man, is so interesting. So at the smaller private university I was at, there's still more people, somewhere in mass, but more like that interaction. But really, like, I know quite a few professors that are like, I don't think they ever want to come back. Like, just let me do the online. It's like they got exhausted. I know people are starting to look at mental health studies, right? From sheltering in place. Like you're saying, perhaps it's that lack of not even their compassion, but it's like no one seems to care. It's like, oh, you lost someone to COVID. It's, right, that whole lack of compassion. So I'm curious how that's perhaps been eating at, I know, again, very generalizable, but specifically like people in our fields, because I know quite a few individuals who are like, I'll go there only when I actually teach, and then it's like going back home. I'm like, it used to be so much more sociable.
Well, it did definitely become a ghost town. I mean, I wasn't even, I moved to UTSA during the pandemic. I wasn't even allowed to move in the office until like my second year.
That's right.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, all my stuff was just in boxes in my office, and they didn't want you on campus because they were trying to spread. And but yeah, I am hopeful. I'm one of those people that, like, um, I'm not big on just being on campus for being on campus sake, but I do like to be in class, and I don't like online teaching. I'm not a big fan of that. I think other colleagues are totally fine with being online. I want to teach in person. I want to engage students, so I do want to have that type of in person. Um, all my classes next year are going to be in person, so hopefully we're getting more slowly reintegrated back into having in person meetings and so forth. Hopefully, we'll start to see more of that again. But I will say this: I feel like there's the in-person classes feel like they're getting lower enrollment. So I have noticed that the online classes, because I think there's a med surg class that was in person and one online, and like the one online had 100 something students, and like the in-person had like students. And so this is a concern because the chair like emailed me asking me about it, and it seemed that some of the students are favoring to these online classes. So it's like, it's not just from the faculty side, maybe not wanting to be on campus, but it's also it seems like some students are preferring, and I actually wonder if that's the older students maybe who had experience on in the campus, because like I just think if I was a new student, I'd want to have a real college experience. Be on campus.
Oh yeah, that's I'm right there with you, especially as going through college. I get why it's nice to teach online, right? It's obviously it's convenient, but as a student, I hated taking online classes.
I don't like teaching it. I don't like and I'm too old to ever have even had the opportunity to have an online class when I was a student. But like I definitely would much rather. I mean, I see the value in online education, but I personally want to be in class having it students. That excites me. I don't. Online class students they won't engage you on.
Yeah, it's and someone should just put one good thing about this pandemic is it just showed us how unprepared we were, and it was like, without a doubt. And now look at how we're trying to, again, back to it. I got told is with regards to the class, oh, you want to teach over the summer? I'm like, yeah, it's good extra income. They're like, do online, because if you do a in-person class, it won't make students don't want to do it. And I'm like, okay, like, well, initially I've taught face to face in the summer before. Like, yes, enrollment's lower, but that's because it's summer, right? People
Well,
are either going home or doing other stuff.
it's
But
always lower, yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah.
it's always lower. It makes sense. But they're like, if you do in person, the class just will not make.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
like, that used to not be a thing. Like, it
Yeah.
was an option, but now it's almost, mandatory. Um, so it's just been
It
really.
seems like there's going to be a period of adjustment where students are like easing back into the classroom,
Mhm.
faculty are easing back into the hallways and meeting and teaching. Um, uh, but I agree with that
Mhm.
comment, though. Silver lining of the pandemic is how build a lot about our leadership, public health. It really a lot about medicine, about pharmaceuticals, just institutions.
Mhm.
All of those broken institutions that were broken before the pandemic were healed once more. That they do not, just teaching us once again that we cannot count on them, that
Mhm.
they do not serve our interests, and giving us more information to mistrust them and have no confidence in them.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
100%. Yeah. Like I said, it's if you're looking for a silver lining.
yeah. We talk about Democrats. We got to talk about Democrats.
Oh yeah. Oh, of course.
Last thing. Or I don't know what your schedule is, but
oh yeah. Oh no, no. We're still.
yeah.
I know it's always fun to like look, but I mean that
Yeah.
whole compassion thing.
Yeah.
It really just
Yeah.
that was a can of worms,
Yeah.
wasn't it, y'all?
Yeah.
But it's good fun. So mobility, right? We kind of talked about people are going to go around. And of course y'all saw similar
Yeah.
trends.
Yeah,
Okay.
that stuff was like interesting because think about this. We, on the individual level, we had these self-reports, like how much you tell me that you mask up, that you vaccinate, social distance. The mobility data was based on people's cell phone movement.
Mhm.
So it was more of an objective indicator of your lifestyle, of your pandemic lifestyle. So you can think about there's all these different ways of measuring lifestyle. You can do self-reports. You can do it through monitoring people's GPSs on their cell phones to see how far they're traveling from home and so forth.
Yeah. And I always love that in studies. A lot of times, when you study something like depression, that's a common one. Well, you have self-reported depression, which is probably most commonly used. But what I love is I've been able to work with data before where you also have you've been medically diagnosed. So kind of like you're saying with the cell phone, it's like subjectively, it's like, do you travel much? It's like, well, again, you're relying on that person to identify. I mean, the travel's like, no, not really. I've been pretty good staying at home. However, you look at something objective like their cell phone, it's like, dude, you're going out almost every day. Like, but it might just be going to go pick up food, going to go but it's not things you necessarily consider really going out. So I love if
so you want to see replication. You want to see replication of the political effects, the religious effects across different ways of measuring objective measures, subjective measures. Because you're right, because people do can lie on a survey. So, but what's good across these studies that I've been publishing is we're seeing consistency across different ways of measuring religion, different ways of political views,
and it's I don't know. It's super interesting, but I love that through the articles that you sent me, seemed to be a pretty general trend I was getting into, and at long last, we're here gonna talk about some good old religion. Y'all know I've been waiting for it because I super fascinating, which is funny. So most of y'all watching know this. I went to where I got my degree was they studied religion, and I went in there not really caring about studying religion, but they turned me around. So now it's like super interesting.
That happened to me too.
Funny, right? It's like I wonder if we know some of the same people. Yeah. So are you good? Do you need to take a break?
No, I'm good.
Oh, you're good. Awesome. So this article here, this one is called "The Blood of Christ Compels Them: State Religiosity and State Population Mobility During the Coronavirus Pandemic." Again, are you the one coming up with the titles? Because I'm loving them. I love it, man. That's for y'all who don't really know much about academics. This is basically like clickbait. It's like, ooh,
you may not like the article, but you'll like the title.
Yeah, you love the title. All right, so we've already talked a little bit about religion, and especially very contentious relationship, and this spans back
Yeah.
since the basically religion. It came right between science, religion, especially between Protestantism and evangelical Christians. So, what are some of the major factors, especially
Yeah.
during the pandemic, that have led to this contentious relationship?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to note that there there is a tension, perceived tension between conservative Christianity and science. There does seem to be this tension, but it wasn't always this case. Always the case. I mean, if you can just look historically, some of the greatest minds known were often very religious, coming from very religious households, or even sometimes like religious leadership,
Mm-hmm.
like ministers and things. There wasn't always this. I think, you know, I'm not a historian of religion, but I will say this: um, have this broader context of secularization, where there are some indicators to suggest that maybe society is becoming less religious. Have this response of the Christian nationalists saying to like renew our Christian traditions, and so forth. And then you have this again competing for the hearts and minds of the people:
Mm-hmm.
science versus religion. And when science started, Scopes trial started, trying to apply science to what was going on in the Bible as a
Mm-hmm.
standard or something like that. Started,
Yeah.
started to cause some ideological rifts. When maybe previously they treated separately.
Right.
Uh, and so I think there's a power struggle going on in science. They seem incompatible, and they are fundamentally one about the natural world, supernatural. Really
Mm-hmm.
um, shouldn't be connected. But there is that competition, and you have these conservative Christians who view biblical literalists and interested in Bible, some
Mm-hmm.
scientist or scientific text, something like that. The blood of Christ that just came from these conservative Christians talking about vaccinated, or they didn't have to worry about the pandemic, were protected by the blood of Christ, and so that was this kind of belief there. Did not help that the government started shutting down of churches during the pandemic,
Right.
because there were some early evidence that were spreading the virus in congregations,
Mm-hmm.
in church settings. And so I think they felt attacked. They were like, "Why are you leaving liquor stores open but closing my church?"
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. Like, I mean, things that, like,
Yeah.
I think they were feeling attacked, and this is, but they, to be fair, they felt attacked before.
Mm.
When you think about things like the supposed war on Christmas, the secularization of society,
Right.
Obama's a Muslim, all this stuff about feeling attacked, feeling left behind. I think that's a part of this rift. Uh, but I will also say this: it's interesting, because the general religion and health literature doesn't really show, a major resistance to healthcare. Actually, a lot of the literature will tend to actually follow doctor checkups more regularly. So it's really interesting that pandemic you started seeing.
Yeah, because man, that's a good point because this even ties back into the initial article, right? That authoritarian belief, right,
Yeah.
is higher religion than your doctor, especially if it's your general, like someone you've been going to. Then it's like, well, of course, yeah, that's what the doctor says. Like
Mm,
you don't question it because you view him as the authority. And
mm,
I wonder if that possibly went down, right? Is because, well, in comes a pandemic, in comes a very charismatic leader. And what if your congregation,
yeah.
right, what's being talked about, discussed during the sermon, and you mentioned something else I want to briefly touch on is, again, we talk about separate, right, it's always like separation between church and state.
Mm,
And this is one of those, that instance of feeling like attacked, like why are you
mhm,
shutting down the church, like
mhm,
that's the state infringing on it. But then you also saw, or discussed earlier, right, this whole Christian nationalism that's like actually kind of wants religion reinserted back
mhm,
into the state. So this kind of uh, dance,
mhm,
right, that they're always doing is another really, again, kind of, it makes the mind boggle, but
Hmm.
I think that's especially how it's tying into COVID behaviors and how that potentially has upset the balance because right, a more supreme authority, if not God, right, it was like Trump, and Trump, go figure, Trump's, the doctor's orders, perhaps in some cases.
You can even think part of this is due to medical authority is increasingly institutions about the examples on a time too much failing
Right.
that's considered a sin and so forth. Now it's considered a disease, and it's like you can just see that institutional dynamics playing out, institutions of medicine having and then trying to resist that and trying to claim its own moral authority, reclaim its own moral.
Wow. Yeah. That's so then
Yeah,
talk about how
yeah,
it's changed.
yeah,
Drinking, which of course has skyrocketed
yeah.
during the
Yeah.
pandemic, is right. It used to, even socially, it'd be like, oh, they have a little bit of a problem. To now,
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's totally a medical scene disease. It's
Hmm. It's been
completely,
medicalized.
yeah, it's been
Yep, yep.
medicalized. It completely uh, changed around. So that's, I
But
hadn't really thought about that.
that's a direct conflict.
Like, so one thing I did note, or I wanted to ask, especially with this article, is, more strains of COVID, right? Kind
Mhm.
of like the flu. There's always going to be a new strain. They tend to not be as deadly as the
Yeah.
initial and Delta, but far more contagious is kind of what seems to be happening. So I wanted to ask, it's, do you feel that religious beliefs that were dismissive of the
Mhm.
severity of COVID might see themselves as vindicated? That the supposed COVID is still high, actually high right now. For
Yeah.
those that don't know,
Yeah.
however, the deaths are nowhere near what they were.
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, we're all. I mean, that's not a unique. I mean, across the political spectrum, we're always looking for information to vindicate,
Hmm.
like our political views, and they have been telling us the whole time that this is like a flu or something like that, and you're right, the severity of coronavirus has declined over time, even as it's infectious. And yeah, I'm sure that there are people saying, "I told you so," and more emboldened to not to get extra sort of social distance, or I'm sure that they are,
Yeah,
because it just reinforces
yeah, it just
was
goes, yeah, exactly. It just goes
yeah,
back to, like you're saying, if price is protecting
yeah,
it. It's just
uh-huh.
like, there we go. I wonder how that gets impacted if, you know, family member
Yeah,
succumbs, right? Like,
yeah.
or they get,
So
seriously ill.
yeah,
That's,
I have so I mean, again, this goes back to this idea when we are talking about. I am not suggesting political conservatives or Christian conservatives don't have this capacity for empathy. In
Mhm.
fact, um, we actually observe that people who are more religious actually do have more empathy. And I think some of here's the way we measure empathy. They're not asking about you. Do you care if members is suffering?
Mhm.
Like they ask in generally, that suffering. And so I have no doubt that conservative Christians, the fact that they prioritize and value family, that those types of dynamics um, could actually change the way they feel about some of these things. Actually, I
Yeah.
actually was like pursuing this type of idea that I thought I wanted to look at conservative Christians who know,
Yes.
and then look at their health behavior. That's something I want
Mhm.
to do in the future, because like it seems like I don't know if that's where you're going, but
Yeah.
it seems
Yeah.
like
That's
I believe that something like that, losing someone close to you, could make the coronavirus real to you
right.
and make you want to be more.
Right. And so,
Yeah,
I agree with
yeah,
that notion, right? In theory, that
yeah,
to me, that would make sense, right?
yeah,
Is like you've seen the severity of this
yeah.
firsthand, but how about,
Could you see people on these deathbed confessions where they're like, "I wish I would have gotten vaccinated," stuff like that. People regret
Wow.
when it comes down to death and being in the hospital. I think people do. It makes it real for them.
Yeah.
And
Which is sad that
yeah,
again, like it
yeah,
has to get to that point because then I want, like you're saying, someone who actually knows someone who's passed who succumbed to COVID, right? What's their interaction
yeah,
now within their own congregation,
yeah,
right? Like, is everything, especially if that person who passed away was also a member of that congregation, that'd be an
yeah.
extra double whammy. It's like, how does the individual deal with that death? How does the congregation deal with that death? Like, does everything, is it, say a prayer for this person and then back to
Well,
whatever
I
we're
mean,
doing?
I think there's, there's also some trying to say I think there's that
That's
initial,
mm,
like not even one. I think there's going to be some initial motivation to not even to admit it's COVID,
yeah,
something else. But yeah, I don't. I mean, I think these are all interesting ideas for research projects because they get it. I like this because it gets us the subjective experience
hmm
of how these COVID dynamics play out. I haven't seen enough research on these loss dynamics. Like, we experienced a lot of loss during the pandemic. People have
yeah,
lost jobs, they've lost friends, they've lost lives that they thought they were going to have.
hmm
And like, I think we've only to even consider these dynamics.
yeah,
And you're right, it's not just your personal experience; it's also people around you. Uh, are going to share that experience.
yeah. I think that's really
Yeah,
fascinating. Like that again, like especially congregation. I know. I think maybe in this article, like you had
mm,
some of the quotes that
yeah,
pastors or
yeah,
preacher what were saying. I know
yeah.
some of them are just like,
I like the one about the
what?
mask, like that.
Yeah, the face of
Yeah, the
God, or
face of God, like the mask covers up the face of God. It prevents you from singing in the choir,
mhm.
and it's like there is a surface level. You're preventing us from carrying out our religious exercise,
Yeah,
and I just kind of understand the motive to some extent. That's really what I'm trying to do with this. Trying to understand the motivations, for people to how do they overcome the risk of death? Maybe that's just
yeah,
because I'm neurotic and I'm like, and like the risk of death like is like really important to me.
yeah,
And it's like and everything else is kind of not as important. But it's like so it's fascinating to me that some people are willing to make that trade-off for political reasons or religious reasons, and that blows my mind.
yeah.
And I have to study that.
Oh yeah, it's
Yeah,
to me it's just
yeah,
again with
yeah,
such a
yeah,
population,
yeah, yeah,
especially this denomination that's
yeah,
so like hardcore into um, right,
yeah,
in a sense
yeah,
kind of downplaying, but it's like how do they deal with the death? Or right, it's perhaps they're just like, well, they died of pneumonia,
yeah,
but they caught that because they
yeah,
had COVID, right?
yeah.
It's
Mm.
man, yeah. So yeah, going hand in hand with that and Christian nationalism, super like and very interesting topics. Um, so one last thing on religious states
Mhm.
is, again, kind of looking at mobility and aging. And so I want to ask, why are there behavioral risks less pronounced among older populations in religious states?
Okay, so we found looking at state. This is now state level, right? We looked at states that were more religious and had a higher percentage of conservative Protestants. They were essentially moving around more during the pandemic, and that was indicated by their cell phone movement, right?
Hmm
So they weren't sheltering in place; they were moving around a lot. But we thought that that pattern might depend on the age structure of the state. For example, if you live in an older state, a state with a higher percentage of people,
hmm
that maybe that might alter your behavior to some extent because there's New Testament and Old Testament doctrine about respecting your elders and caring for your elders,
hmm
and so we thought that that type of rhetoric, might mean something to conservative Protestant populations that are also surrounded by elderly populations, and that's
Yeah.
essentially what we found is that you did find that conservative Protestant states higher percentages of conservative Protestants were moving around more during the pandemic and
Mhm.
they were staying at home less. But but that was less common in states that were also older or had more elderly people. And so there's this idea that when you're exposed more to elderly people who are especially vulnerable, we all know that the
Yes.
elderly were especially vulnerable to the pandemic, that they were maybe, reining back some of their movement a little bit, because they were surrounded by elderly people. And so that just shows some of the complexities that that sometimes, the conservative Christianity isn't isn't always a clear risk. Sometimes there are certain subpopulations where the
Mhm.
conservative Christianity is actually risky.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
Yeah,
because right, if your friends
yeah,
are not going out,
yeah,
then you're probably not going to be going out nearly as much.
yeah,
Yeah, because from that article, "Love Thy Aged,"
yeah,
um,
yeah,
again,
yeah,
another
yeah.
another stellar title, man. I'm loving them. And chat, I'll
Yeah,
post all these articles
yeah,
once we finish the interview, so y'all and can go up yourselves. They're worth the reads. And but yeah, just that like you said, there's subpopulation because by and large, and everyone listening, like, man, they're talking a lot about conservatives, and Protestants. Don't worry, we'll talk about liberals.
mhm,
But right, that's like the one thing. It's like, oh, it seems like more risk taking. But I that's what stood out to me and why I liked it. I wanted to
mhm,
bring up this article. So well, there are subpopulations, right? It's not
mhm.
a cut and dry,
Homogenous group.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it's because and that seems this goes back to how
Yeah.
we like to politicize everything. We
Yeah.
like it either yes, no,
Yeah.
like it's all cut and dry, and I like it
And
that
we haven't
it's
even
not.
done a good job. In my opinion, we haven't even looked at the subgroup very,
Hmm.
like, different types of conservatives, different types of conservative Christians. We haven't even looked at like gender variations or anything like that. Like, there's got to be some subgroup variation.
Right, it
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah.
especially once you start looking at like race,
Yeah.
ethnicity, and then
Yeah.
down further
Yeah,
south,
and
like
race. Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Exactly. Because like, yeah, because you think like a lot of this conservative process is probably driven by the conservative Christians and
Mhm.
not black Protestants.
Yeah, not which is
Yeah.
again, that's like a
Yeah.
whole another
Yep.
area to explore. So
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
still lots of exciting stuff with
Yep.
regards to how religion
Yeah.
ties into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So yes, we've obviously talked a lot about Christian relationships and COVID, and now it's time to share the love with the other side of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
So, what are pandemic risks that are associated with more liberal
Yeah.
side of politics?
So I want to be clear. So, my research has been focused on conservative politics and conservative religion. Because I focused there first because I saw the most immediate connection to the pandemic risk, right?
Mhm.
Because those were the vocal kind of opposition to public health initiatives and so forth. So I have framed conservatism as an existential threat during a pandemic, but I think it could be extended. Same groups of people also are like environmentalists, deny climate change and so forth. I think it's time that we really start to think seriously, about threat of conservatism. But I will say this, that doesn't mean that the liberal side of the spectrum and Democrats can be absolved, from some of contributing to the culture war, and I think also
Mhm.
denying science. Okay, you can think about. It may have started out that Democrats were like all on board with whatever the CDC was saying at the time,
Mhm.
and that Republicans were not. But the problem is that as the CDC has changed their guidelines to pull back mandates and so forth, the Democrats have stuck with it, have maintained that, and in a
Yeah.
sense are now conflicting with the public health CDC guidance. So it would be hypocritical for us to judge conservatives for denying the public health recommendations, but to not also similarly judge or question or wonder why Democrats are, especially like in states like California, are still
Mhm.
maintaining mandates and pushing vaccines and they want you to mask your children. They want you to get repeated vaccinations, even if you're not at risk.
Yeah.
They want to vaccinate children, younger children, without clinical evidence to support the efficacy of vaccinations for young children. Um, They want to avoid. There's a lot of Democrats and people I know like that. They still don't want to eat inside restaurants. They don't want to go to
Yeah.
public events and so forth because they believe there's still a large segment, I believe, of Democrats who believe they're gonna evade or avoid getting COVID the rest of their lives, and
Yeah.
that's not true.
Yeah. It's pretty much
Yeah,
right. You have to shelter in
yeah,
place for life now
yeah,
to even have a
yeah.
chance of that. Yeah.
It's not possible.
It,
It's not
it
possible.
it's
It's
not.
endemic now. It's
Hmm.
endemic. It'll be with us for the rest of our lives. We're going to get COVID. It's going to be a seasonal thing. People are talking about that. But we have to also recognize that actively trying to avoid your breakthrough infection after you become vaccinated, that does not help with herd immunity. That does not help because you have to understand the epidemiological data has made it really clear that the healthiest group are people who have a vaccination and a breakthrough infection. That's called
Yeah.
hybrid immunity. Okay, it's having both the immunity from the vaccine and immunity from an infection. Those people have the lowest rates of morbidity and mortality from the epidemiological data, and
Mhm.
that's better than a vaccine alone or better than infection alone. And so that's like really important to realize. Um, but I think we have to really be skeptical about, what does masking children, giving vaccines to children, giving people boosters for the rest of their life. When there are immunologists, I've heard immunologists wonder about how continuous boosters of these vaccines might alter our immune system going forward.
Right.
And you had said this earlier. We don't know much about um, effects of long COVID. We don't know much about, in my opinion, and what I've known. I'm not an immunologist. I'm not a medical doctor. Not a real doctor. Um, but we don't know much about the long term effects of these vaccinations because they weren't
Right.
properly tested,
Right.
and they're certainly not. They certainly have not been properly tested for young children, even though they're being allowed to be trying to push them on young children. And you'd have to wonder how much of this is something that we call in medical sociology disease mongering, where you're just where the pharmaceutical companies and the politicians that they bought off are just kind of expand their markets
Mhm.
for the vaccines,
Yes.
and we have to wonder about that. Have to wonder about that because we know our politicians are paid by pharmaceutical companies. We have to wonder about their motivations,
Mhm.
for pushing these vaccines on us. And I'm very critical of pharmaceutical industry, and so we have to be very concerned about that. I think we also have to, when you're thinking about um, mandating vaccines and so forth, you have to really start to question where you personally fit on the issue of bodily autonomy.
Right.
If you support the issue of bodily autonomy in the case of abortion, do you support the issue of bodily autonomy in the instance of requiring people, mandating people to get vaccines, or they'll lose their jobs, or they'll lose their
Yeah.
livelihoods and so forth? Is that really what we want? And ultimately, this is the question that I want to leave people with: is when you think about how Democrats and liberals have approached the pandemic, and thinking about their current behavior and how they are kind of acting at variance with the CDC recommendations, was this really about the science?
Right. That's oof.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's a thinker
yeah, it
because
is.
definitely got some opinions. Got
Yeah.
some people going in chat. That's for sure.
Well,
Let's see. I think I saw there was a question. So, oh, Hitman, yes. Yes, there are basically two types of religion, uh, dharmic and Abrahamic. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Okay, so yeah,
mhm.
but why do we see a tussle among Abrahamic religion, but not that much dharmic
I
religions?
don't know much about
Yeah.
the non-Christian religions in terms of the pandemic, and I haven't seen much data coming from other countries also on this, other than uh, I haven't seen much replication, so I can't really.
Hmm.
I think it's a really good question because I think you raise a really important point. We are overemphasizing like the Christian population. We are
Hmm.
overemphasizing the conservative Christian population, and we actually don't know much about moderate Christians, liberal Christians, people who are not Christian. Um, and, I don't want to mislead you because I want to admit to you when I don't know something and I don't know much about that. But I will tell you, I think we need to know more about that because it's the story. The story of religion and COVID isn't just about conservative Christians.
Right.
There's and it also isn't just about the U.S. You know, and you know, I'd love to know how Buddhists, think about the pandemic. You know, I'd love to know how you know, Muslims think about the and but yeah, no, I don't have a good answer on you know what's going on
All right, and I'm
there.
obviously I'm
Yeah,
still kind of same boat,
yeah,
but I think it is really interesting, and it just shows that there's still so much research that needs and can be done. So, chat, are there any final questions? I feel like I'm in my lecture hall again.
yeah. It feels good. It
Yeah,
feels good. It feels
feels good.
natural to me.
Yeah. um, cool. Well, listen, thank you all so much for tuning in, and especially thank you to Dr. Terrence Hill for taking the time to do this interview. I've really
Pleasure.
enjoyed it. I hope you all have enjoyed it as well. Lots of good information. I'll be, like I said, I'll be posting the titles of the articles so you can Google them, check them out.
You can
And
also email me. Feel free to email me for copies of the articles or
okay,
follow up questions about the articles. And also contact me. So
okay. So y'all heard him. Look up, check him out. Dr. Terrence Hill at
just
UTSA.
put the name of the podcast on the subject.
Yeah, yeah. He'll know.
Yeah,
He'll know.
I'll know what's up. I'll know what's up. I will give you priority.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. That's a big thing
In
because
my
UTSA.
inbox priority.
I love it. All right. Well, again, thank you everyone tuning in. Remember, if you have not followed, please hit the follow button and also check out the YouTube channel. I'll be uploading this here, hopefully by the end of today. So, thank you all again and take care. I'll see y'all on the next one. Bye.
Bye.